All right, welcome here on the third panel. This panel is dedicated to the comparative perspective in radicalization and resilience to the radicalization. We have 4 distinguished speakers here. I mean, 3 are here with us. The 4th one is online, unfortunately. As far as I understood from the papers, we're going to look at the Western Balkans. We're going to look at the MENA region, we're going to look at the Middle East, and the speakers will share with us their perspective and also their research from the field, as far as I understood. So the first speaker is Ann-Kristin Jonasson, sorry. She is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and deputy director of the Center of European Research. And I was looking at your biography, and I've seen that democracy promotion, EU democracy promotion, is the key word. And I think you're going to share your research here with us, so I'm really looking forward to it. So please have a floor.
Thank you. Yes, that's very much my way into this. First, I want to thank you all, the organizers, and it's so great. For the first time, for almost 2 years, I was able to travel, and I'm able to experience a new city. I'm so happy to be here in Belgrade. I'm also happy to see all the people in person. It's such a nice change after all these digital meetings, even if we do have some on link here as well. But I'm also very happy to be included in this context, because this is quite a new field to me. And it's been so interesting listening to all of your presentation and giving me all these rich insights all morning that really helped me understand a lot about what I'm trying to figure out here, because as we heard, I come in to this field from the studies of EU democracy promotion. So I have realized, so I'm writing on that, but then I realized that the EU in its democracy promotion are connecting democracy with work against terrorism, or the fight on terrorism. And I was curious how this works and how the EU thinks about this and how it works in practice and how it works in theory. So that's why I have ventured on this trip. And I tried to navigate these waters. It's, as I said, a new field to me, so I've been a bit focused on trying to define the concepts. And I'm not entirely sure that I got it right, so please correct me if I understood some of the concepts wrongly. Yeah, it's a very fascinating and very important field. The topic of my research I have called the double-edged sword of democracy, how democracy promotion is used by the European Union's external action, how democracy promotion is used in the European Union's external action against terrorism in the Middle East. And this starts very much in the EU's global strategy that was launched in 2016, where the EU vows to fight terrorism with roots in the Middle East, which it sees as threatening European security in different ways. And it's interesting to read this global strategy quite carefully, because it's set out to direct the EU's work globally, so it's a global strategy. And the EU addresses this risk for the risk of terrorism in different ways. Not least, also, not only, I should say, in the global strategy, but it really starts out in 2005, when the European Union has launched its European Union counter-terrorism strategy. There it takes a strategic commitment to combat terrorism globally in 4 approaches. It's prevent, protect, pursue, and respond. And in 2020, these were updated to anticipate, prevent, protect, and respond. And here comes my first attempt at definitions of different concepts. And I try to distinguish between what I find as security-related counter measures against violent extremism. So these what are usually called as CVE, and the more preventive ways of more social security, social policy ways of preventing violent extremism. That is what I call PVE. I understand that these are often used together, and I'm not really sure how this is used in this discourse, so I'm trying to understand more about this, this conceptual divide. But from my interpretation then, prevent and counteract, I would argue that, for instance, in this last list of things that the EU wants to do to fight terrorism, I will argue that it anticipate, protect and respond are part of the countering violent extremism part, the CVE part, while prevent then is preventing the PVE part. And I want to focus here on the preventive measures, the PVE. And when I look more closely into the documents, I can see then that one EU method in the policy documents to prevent terrorism, as then opposed to counteract terrorism, is to work for democracy. And it's very clearly put in this global strategy that EU sees the work for democracy to prevent terrorism and to work for resilience. So there we have the connection with resilience. A democratic society in the document, in the global strategy, is a society that is resilient to terrorism. However, I find that this is a method with crucial pitfalls, so I'm quite interested in understanding how the EU thinks about these things in practice, but also how it works theoretically. So this is what I have tried to figure out. So I start out looking at these more social policy approaches, the more preventive approaches to fight terrorism, to prevent terrorism then. Looking at the discourse, I find that three things stand out when it comes to these preventative measures. It's that social policy approaches must be employed in context-sensitive ways. That's something that we heard about today earlier. We must also look out for unintended consequences, that things not always end up as we expect them to. There can even be counterproductive consequences. Another thing with social policy approaches is that they are prone to be subordinated to the security policy approaches in ways that actually might lead to further radicalization rather than preventing terrorism then. So there are many challenges in the prevention of terrorism. It's also very clear in the literature that to fight terrorism, both soft approaches targeting the societal roots of terrorism, what I call prevent, PVE, and the hard security-focused top-down approaches, what I call counteract, CVE, are needed in a cohesive agenda. But it's also very clear then that in such integration, the soft approaches are prone to be under-prioritized, and the security approaches are prone to be prioritized in the policy outcome. So I want to see how does the EU deal with all these challenges. First, I wanted to think a little bit about the idea, so why would democracy and democracy promotion prevent terrorism, as it's set out to do in the global strategy, for instance? According to the argument of the EU, strengthening democracy and the values attached to it would help weeding out the root causes of terrorism. But why, I ask myself. Also coming from democracy promotion studies, I know that democracy is often used for all sorts of good things, but people rarely have a very definitive idea on exactly what democracy means and what it actually does. And the studies will show that everybody has different interpretations of democracy. So I'm a bit wary about using the concept democracy because people are prone to use it in ways that benefit their own interests. So as soon as democracy is mentioned, I'm a bit suspicious. Okay, so the reasoning on the EU side is not very specific when it comes to why democracy should weed out the root causes of terrorism. doing a little bit of my own thinking, reading a little bit about, between the lines in the documents, one can come to the conclusion that the idea is that opening up peaceful avenues for discontent, making for inclusion, and wider distribution of rights and opportunities, social justice and services are regarded as preemptive of terrorism. It's also interesting because I'm dealing with the Mediterranean region, the Middle East. It's interesting to just think about the idea that we have heard about earlier today also, that jihadi terrorism is generally portrayed as, in Western narratives, as diametrically opposed to different aspects of democracy. So here we also see that there's a clear divide between democracy and this jihadist terrorism. When I go to the academic literature, it's all what I've seen often taken as a given that democracy will work against terrorism. But I find not very much discussion on the theoretical foundation for the assertion then that democracy prevents terrorism. And here I'm very happy to get more insights from you, because I do see some problems with the idea that democracy prevents terrorism. One of the things I've already alluded to, that is the question, how do we define democracy? What is democracy? I find in my studies that there is no common definition of democracy between partners. Also within the EU, they have big problems of defining exactly what democracy means. So different definitions carry different implications. So that's very problematic if you're going to use democracy. So what democracy are you using? Also, it's very clear from democratization studies that democracy must grow from within a country to take root. You cannot just apply it somewhere. It needs to be grown from within. And that means that contextualization is of extreme importance. Another problem that could be connected to democracy, and also what we have been touching on today, is that democracy may be prone to giving rise to polarization, that the free speech and freedom of organization and all these freedoms need to be understood and used in a democratic way in order to further democracy. Otherwise, democracy can be used to lead to further polarization. So whereas democracy and detached freedoms must be based on many things, but among other things, communal values, rule of law, not to lead to animosity rather than amicable communal relations. So if it doesn't, democracy can be divisive. We must remember that there is a divisive possibility within democracy and this risk of polarization. So in order, I think, for democracy to prevent terrorism, people really need to understand what democracy is about. And I'm not always sure that people do that. Also, democratization as a process of becoming democracy is very insecure, very unstable, might actually lead to a lot of polarization. So while the argument is that democracy leads to economic development and things that can prevent terrorism, this is generally in established, consolidated democracies. Whereas in democratizing countries, they can prove to be very unstable and not delivering as established democracies do. Another irony is obviously that foreign terrorist fighters often come from Europe, often come from Tunisia, which is the most democratic Muslim country in the Middle East. So that is also a bit ironic. So what I've been trying to do in my research here, I've been trying to see, based on these, what you should look at when you look at the prevention of terrorism is whether these policies are used in a context-sensitive way, if the EU is wary of any unintended consequences, and whether the EU stays clear of subordinating social policy approach of democracy promotion to security policies, or if there is a process of securitization going on. So I've been making interviews in Brussels, in the External Action Service, at the EU, at the Commission, the European Commission. And I will just share a few of my preliminary results here. Based on these interviews, you can see that democracy is seen as a necessary but not sufficient tool in preventing terrorism. Goods connected to democracy, like rule of law, lack of corruption, are regarded as preventing terrorism. Some unintended consequences of democracy, like the potential radicalizing effect of free speech, are, however, recognized. Generally, it's the outcomes related also to socioeconomic development, such as social justice and services, are seen as what is primarily preventing terrorism. It's also quite obvious that the fight on terrorism is primarily set in a security frame, then largely, if not fully, subordinating this social policy concerns, including democracy. So we see a process of securitization going on. And this goes also for the concept of resilience. Resilience was not something that came up during any interview. So I had to prompt the interviewees asking, okay, so how do you connect resilience in the global strategy? Resilience is seen as part of this approach to prevent terrorism. And they said, yeah, there was something about resilience in the global strategy, wasn't there? We don't work on like that. So they didn't talk about it so much, but when I prompted them, it was also put in a security frame. So it was about controlling the population, keep everything stable, and in that sense. So it was used in a very different sense from what I think we are using it here today, which is quite interesting. It's interesting from the interviews that contextualization was put forth as very important by the EU interviewees, and also the importance of prevention from within. So it was quite strongly coming forth. But what was mainly, primarily coming forth was the strong emphasis on the intergovernmental realities, that the EU cannot do something that the states are not interested in. And obviously the states are not so interested in democracy if they are. They are this is part of the dilemma, that if you are working with an authoritarian state claiming to wanting to democratize, you can ask what motivations there are on their part to actually do this. Preliminary conclusions, which are very much in the making, and which I make as I sit and listen to the rest of you. So I just try to finish this up now. From the practice, you can see that despite the focus in the EU policy documents, democracy promotion is not generally framed by EU representatives as a way to prevent terrorism. The prevention of terrorism is securitized, and in the sense that social policy approaches are not prioritized, and the same goes for resilience. While some goods related to democracy is regarded as preventing terrorism, it's also recognized that democracy can have these counterproductive effects and can result in unintended consequences, not least the polarization. We can see the irony of Tunisia and Europe. We can see some positive traits that the EU actually are recognizing the importance of contextualization and prevention to come from within, and it's very strong emphasis on women teachers and imams. And also very importantly, I think, that the EU sees very clearly that the EU should stay out of religion. So it's very important that the EU does not support any religious initiatives, because this will interpreted in the wrong way. So they are wary that what they do could have counterproductive consequences. It's clear that the intergovernmental realities frame the EU's work with the partner countries on terrorism prevention, and the EU cannot go further or do other things that the partners don't accept. When it comes to theory, and this is my very final remarks, democracy might work to prevent terrorism in some aspects, but it might exacerbate it in others. It actually might be this double-edged sword that I started to ask about, whether democracy is a double-edged sword. It's important here to sort out the logics, what is really preventing terrorism. Perhaps it's primarily the good outcomes, inclusive societies with social justice, lack of corruption, that will prevent terrorism. Democracy has proved to be successful in providing such outcomes, but that's in well-established consolidated democracies. Democratizing countries often fail in these regards, sometimes even more so than authoritarian states. There are risks in this securitization that is going on when you subordinate democracy to stability and security. This may actually reinforce the authoritarian regimes. That also goes for this strong focus on the socioeconomic development that the EU respondents often come back to, that we need to support this economic situation, so that will breed democracy. So this is the modernization theory. It has big problems connected to it. Some will argue that it's dead, and actually socioeconomic development also can strengthen authoritarian states. So my proposition is that the risks of unintended consequences of democracy promotion in relation to terrorism are higher if democracy is not promoted properly. So only true democracy, which are based on the needs and the situation in the particular country, and not subordinated to security concerns or intergovernmental realities, must be promoted if it is to prevent terrorism. And to do so, you need to figure out the local contextualization of democratization. And you need to work on the inclusion, connection, this mutual social contract that democracy needs to be built on. I argue that only if you do that, democracy will prevent terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann-Kristin, for a very provoking presentation. Yeah, the next speaker is going to be Morten Boas. Hopefully I pronounced the name correctly. I'll try. And he's the research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, conducting field in Africa and the Middle East. And currently he's the principal investigator of the EU Horizon 2020 funded project PREVEX, preventing violent extremism in the Balkans and MENA region, strengthening resilience, enabling environments. So Morten, please have a floor.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers. Great to be back here in Belgrade with our friends from the Beograd Center for Security Policy, and also interesting to do a presentation with my good friend and colleague Kamran Palani, sort of looming over me in the background. I guess Kamran is somewhere in the Iraqi Kurdistan region, and I look forward to hearing his presentation thereafter. You mentioned the PREVEX project, Vera, and I mean this paper is coming out of this project called PREVEX, Preventing Violent Extremism in the Balkans and the broader MENA region, Strengthening Local Resilience. And this paper, which is very much in the making, because we are just about to finalize the last round of data gathering in all these regions. I flew out of Burkina Faso Sunday evening and came here yesterday. We have still some wrap-up fieldwork going on in Mali, but also other places in North Africa, Middle East. Here in the Balkans, most of the fieldwork is completed by now. So we are in the process now of putting all of this together. So this is something that we discussed while in the field, actually, with my two great colleagues, Kari Osland, which is sitting here, and which we saw as the moderator in the previous panel, and our great colleague, Abdul Wahab Sissé, who is based in the Sahel. And we have called this sort of our first stab at this. We have called Understanding and Enabling Environments in the Balkans and the MENA, the occurrence and the non-occurrence of violent extremism. And one of the sort of starting points for the whole PREVEX project is this observation that the whole study of violent extremism, of whether it is of the ethno-nationalist type, right-wing, left-wing, or the jihadi type, has had a tendency to focus on the very manifestation of the phenomenon without paying a similar due to the fact that there is a lot of immense local resilience out there. And that local resilience is not only something that is taking place in parts of Europe or in the Balkans, but also in very weak states in the Middle East, in the Sahel and in North Africa, where local communities do resist. They are able to create local resilience to this phenomenon. And that has not been very much focused on and is less properly understood. So this is what we are trying to do in this project, and we are going to say something about it based on a very preliminary reading of the data in this presentation. But first, I mean, why the Balkan and the MENA region? Well, I mean, the very sort of incremental functional answer to that is that this was the call of the European Union. So basically, I mean, if you wanted to compete for this particular call, you needed to put together a comparative study of violent extremism and local resilience in the Balkan and the MENA. Obviously, there are differences here that needs to be taken into consideration. First and foremost, perhaps the geography and the proximity to Europe and the EU, which do matter a lot there. Secondly, I mean, the level of state stability and fragility. I mean, obviously, there has been written a lot about also state fragility and state volatility in the case of the Western Balkans, but believe me, there is an enormous difference between, for example, the Serbian state, the North Macedonian state, the Bosnia-Herzegovina state, and, for example, states like Mali, Niger. There is an enormous difference with regard to state stability and thereby also fragility. There are also important trends concerning recruitment and mobilization, and Florian Bieber pointed to some of the same observations that we have. And one very obvious one is that when it comes to violent extremism, we can talk about perhaps an exporting Balkan. Why do I call it exporting? Because, I mean, the Balkan is sending foreign fighters elsewhere. They may have been radicalized in the Balkans, but by and large, if they conduct violence, it's elsewhere than in the Balkans. So the Balkans is exporting. The Middle East is both importing and exporting, while North Africa and the Sahel, we mainly talk about internal home-ground recruitment and mobilization. And these are important macro distinctions that we need to take into consideration. And it leads us also to ask the question, again, I'm quite surprised how similar this is to some of Florian Bieber's observation, because we haven't really talked about this at all. But we ask the question, is in fact the Balkan, the whole of Balkan, a case of non-occurrence? At least the question should be asked. But there are also similarities, we believe. Enabling environments. Parts of the Western Balkan is an enabling environment for violent extremism. And very much of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel is an enabling environment. And by an enabling environment, if you're going to look at this on a sort of macro scale comparatively, we talk about the existence of weak and or illegitimate state structures, failed and blocked popular aspirations from parts or very large parts of the populations who feel that something is unfulfilled. Whoever is ruling their countries are not delivering, be it liberal democracy or something else, it hasn't delivered. Constrained livelihoods, not necessarily that people are falling into absolute poverty, but a sense that the space of living is increasingly constrained year after year, and whoever is in power is not able to address the livelihood challenges that this is creating. And both, all these three regions are also the victims of different types of external and internal shocks that has hit the states, but also severely affected the populations. And we argue, based on our finding here, that in such environments, and here we prefer to use the term agents of violent extremism, that we define as violent entrepreneurs. And the reason for this is simply to avoid this trap of this being seen as just something that jihadi actors do, or something that is entirely sort of related to the opposite side of the coin, right-wing ethno-nationalism. We want to sort of include and look at least in some of these cases, how these also, in a way, feed into each other and may reinforce, but may also, in fact, at sometimes sporadically collaborate together. And these violent entrepreneurs, they have a possibility to operate in these kind of enabling environments. And violent entrepreneurs we define as non-state armed actors possessing some kind of political agenda, very broadly defined. which is implemented in tandem with different types of income-generating activities. So parts of this is also about income-generating activities, both for the members involved in this, the people involved, but also for the organizations. And that, we believe, is something that is quite similar both to the ethno-nationalist side of the coin and the jihadi side of the coin. And they rule, to the extent that they rule, in quotation mark, through force and violence, but they also distribute some resources, either to parts of the populations or only to those that sort of are members of these as organizations, however loosely they may be. And they provide, at least for some level of order and offer protection, at least to parts of the population in areas that they either control or are attempting to control. This leads us to ask the question, why do they, the violent entrepreneurs, not have the same effect everywhere in an enabling environment? And then we need to understand occurrence, but for the purpose of preventing violent extremism, even more important to understand the non-cases of occurrence. And what are then the conditions of non-occurrence based on our research? Sometimes interventions do succeed, that there are interventions that succeed. So, sometimes even EU interventions succeed.
Good.
Sometimes national interventions succeed, and sometimes there are very local interventions that in fact succeed in creating a larger degree of resilience. But our research also shows that there are other less tangible features, power relations and dimensions that are present in one area and not in the other. And that could explain the occurrence and the non-occurrence. For example, I mean, based on the data that we have from the Sahel, I mean, the lineage to which local religious leaders belongs seems to carry some importance. So it's not necessarily that the local religious leaders are present, but who do they represent and what kind of family lineage they represent seems to carry some importance. In some cases, intermarriages across either sectarian, religious, or ethnic cleavages seems to, under certain conditions, to increase levels of local resilience. Not everywhere, and it can easily be broken down, but some places it do work. We also see some evidence that functional ties that last even in crisis between groups both with different and or similar economic interest may help to create levels of local resilience, pointing to the fact that under a lot of what is happening, particularly, but not exclusively, in North Africa and the Sahel, are very deep questions concerning economic uncertainty and a feeling of constantly living in an economic crisis. This, again, this argument about unfulfilledness. To understand both the cases of occurrence and non-occurrence, we need to understand how violent entrepreneurs gain a grip on local populations. Because it's this, their ability to get this grip that we would like to sort of find out what are the antidote to this locally. How do we increase local communities' resilience to the kind of grip that these groups can gain? And then we need to understand also how they attempt to govern, because they do govern. And an interesting part here, and I think this is hugely important, is that how do they seek to govern? Their governance modalities, and that we believe is uniform across this set of cases, is not an they may have an anti-state discourse, but how they actually do this is rather a form of flexible and adaptive mimicking of state practices. They are not anti-state. As respondents in the Sahel says, it's just like the state, but it works. And in here, there is also a pathway to solving parts of this. Because what people are craving for is not necessarily a theocracy or something opposite on the other side of the coin on ethno-nationalism. Many of the ordinary people involved in this, they're simply craving for a state that actually works. And that is what we have to give them, or help them to achieve. I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to be very quick. On the role of the state, I mean, the response of the state can itself contribute both to occurrence and non-occurrence. And here we need to sort of look at how states, some have non-discriminate, very harsh approaches to this. For example, in parts of the Sahel, in Mali, I mean, the stereotyping of young Fulani herders as jihadi has clearly backfired immensely. And we have, looking also in the Balkans, you have examples of these kind of stereotyping of groups, either by state, but also by other social groups that stereotypes each other. And that will backfire, it will always backfire. The antidote to this is, of course, a much more targeted and context-sensitive approach. So let me just end by saying that what these groups do and what highlights their success is their ability to appropriate local grievances. And that is something that we believe is a commonality between this large spectrum of jihadi insurgents on one side and violent ethno-nationalism, extreme right-wing on the other. To some extent, what they all do when they are successful is that they appropriate local grievances of some sort. And particularly in the extreme cases of enabling environments, you can in fact govern on a shoestring. If you can offer people an alternative where either none really exist, or perhaps it's the case with some of the ethno-nationalist groups in the Balkans, they offer people a more credible alternative than the alternatives that exist. Then you can, in fact, and by govern, I mean getting a grip on certain populations relatively cheaply. And this is particularly the case if you can combine coercive violent activities with some service provision, when both activities are either dressed up in a pious religious political language, which is the case of the jihadi, or dressed up in what seems like a credible ethno-nationalist language to other groups, both of them trying to create some sort of mythical path back to a time when things were orderly, where people could live what predictable lives instead of what many feel like now, that they are living in an impenetrable fog of a reality that really doesn't make sense to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. I see the link here again being repeated to be local and regional sensitive. It's been repeated here since the morning, so I just see it here. Okay, so let's go to the next speaker, which is Professor Umut Korkut. He is the project coordinator and professor of international politics at Glasgow School for Business and Society. And he's being specialized in Eastern European and Turkish politics, migration, and religion, gender, and politics. So please have a floor.
Thanks very much, Vera. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be back to Belgrade. I've been a PhD student at, well, I was a PhD student at Central European University in Budapest, and I've been coming down south quite a few times while I've been there. And it's so great to see the evolution of this fantastic city. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. Now, the reason why I'm here is to present the Horizon 2020 project that I'm leading called DRAD. The project has been funded by the European Commission in July 2020, and we started working in December 2020. So the project is de-radicalization in Europe and beyond. We're looking into detect, resolve, and reintegration related issues. So we're not studying radicalization, in essentialism through any kind of essentialism, but we're approaching it rather holistically to understand how radicalization practically takes place, and de-radicalization can take place all the way from United Kingdom to Israel, Jordan, and Iraq. So I prepared really nice slides and maps, but I can't really show them to you. The presentation has a contribution from my colleagues in Berlin and Paris, Professor Mihai Varga and Volodymyr Ishenko, as well as my colleagues from the DRAD project, Stephen Sawyer and Roman Zinegrant, based at American University in Paris. So anyways, I mean, we're working with radicalization and de-radicalization kind of issues in 17 different countries. We started the project in December 20, as I said, and we couldn't do much field work given the corona pandemic. However, we published loads of reports. They're all on our website, and I was going to share you, of course, the website here as well, but I can't show you the PowerPoint again. So, but if you look for dradproject.com, I'm sure you'll see our projects over there. So just to present actually our holistic approach here, we're, for example, looking to right-wing extremism, and then we come across that in UK, in France, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, Finland, Turkey, Georgia, and Israel, and to a certain extent in Jordan and Iraq. Obviously, we come across that in Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia as well in the region. We look into jihadist extremism, and then we came across that in France, Italy, Austria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Finland, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel again, and to a lower extent in UK, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Serbia, and Georgia. We also look into other religious extremism. Once again, we don't want to essentialize jihadism too much. And then we came across other religious extremism, particularly in Georgia, in our research. And I'm also going to talk a bit about this. We're really interested in state complicity in certain places to trigger and resonate radicalization-related politics. We also take left-wing extremism, although I have to note that left-wing extremism has been on the wane in a few places, but we came across that in France, Italy, and Serbia, to once again lower extent in other countries where we do our research. And finally, we take separatist extremism, and we came across that in almost all DRAD countries, all the way from Iraq to UK, from Poland to Italy. Now, we took school shooting, for example, as an act of radicalization because we're interested in, we studied and we already published papers on stakeholders of radicalization, trends of radicalization, as well as media and cultural tools, aspects of radicalization, plus legal aspects of de-radicalization. For example, school shooting, we came across taking place in Finland particularly. It was really interesting, and we didn't really see it as an act of radicalization in other places, and we're planning to go into that when it comes to understanding actually why certain acts of violence, are they really issues to do with some psychological disorders, or can they be explained more with more kind of macro political factors. Now, I mean, DRAD is a comparative study, as you could see, of radicalization and polarization in Europe and beyond. We aim to identify the actors' networks, wider social context driving radicalization, particularly among young people. Now, in order to understand radicalization, and in order to understand the spectrum that radicalization or radicalized actors travel through, we introduce a spectrum called IGAP spectrum. And we believe that certain feelings of injustice are triggering grievance, alienation, and polarization, hence IGAP, injustice, grievance, alienation, and polarization, kind of spectrum. And then as a person travels along the spectrum, their inclination or proclivity towards radicalization increases. Then what becomes a matter for us is practically how we can really come up with tools to build resilience against the feelings of injustice so that it would not really trigger grievance, alienation, and polarization. In that case, actually, our goal is moving towards more measurable evaluations of de-radicalization programs all through. Now, as I said, actually, DRAD accounts for the problem that processes of radicalization often occur in circumstances that escape the control and scrutiny of traditional national frameworks of justice. So for us, justice is a very important issue. To understand actually why people feel themselves unjustly treated, and then why would they really commit heinous acts at the face of their feelings of injustice. And we're trying to understand this through the participation of artificial intelligence professionals in their modeling, analyzing, and devising solutions to online radicalization, as well as social psychology-related interventions. So this is where we're at now. We're starting our second year with DRAD, and at the moment, actually, we already created a dictionary of IGAP whereby we located like mild, moderate, and extremist kind of languages that are expressed by the proponents of radicalization. And from there, we're trying to understand actually how we can really develop artificial intelligence-related tools so that we can extract the information through various online channels, and then we can understand the process. I'm not really saying that obviously we're going to find a solution to this. I don't think that anyone really accepts that, but we're more interested actually to produce rather programs and products that can be used by various police agents. Right, so what do we do then? I mean, at the last year, and that's going to be the resilience-related aspect of this research, we're going to put in place arts and sports, spatial intervention, as well as civic education related tools in order to use creative research methods or spatial interventions through urban planning, as well as civic education tools, so that we can perhaps build reintegration related issues. Now, that's where I come from. I'm not a radicalization scholar. My background is in migration and social inclusion, as Vera kind of shared with you. So our focus to understanding radicalization practically has been to understand like why people feel themselves unjustly treated and how we can really make people talk to each other. How, let's say, whom you consider as the other can talk to the self in non-politicized environments, so that people they start to get to know each other in a non-political environment rather than looking at each other in a highly politicized tools. So this is where we're doing now. Thus far, what we achieved and what we published, as I said, there on our website. But I'm just going to give you a brief outline of what our reports are showing us with respect to events, mechanisms, and structures of radicalization/de-radicalization all around in these 17 countries. Now, the events that we mentioned around feelings of injustice, let's say, they do not obviously automatically lead to radicalization or de-radicalizations. There are various factors that would affect sequences of common, let's say, robust mechanisms of radicalization, such as boundary formation and activation, in-group and out-group brokerage, legitimization and delegitimization, diffusion and emulation, internationalization of international conflicts into internalization of international conflicts into domestic politics, threat and opportunity attribution, alienation, and polarization. But not only how, but why of radicalization is important for us. So we need to understand radicalization around an escalating crisis of political representation after all. So we believe that radicalization has an element of contentious politics. There was a colleague who was reflecting on this in the morning session, which I really appreciated. However, we also realized what Morten discussed in terms of the local micro kind of contention, and how what happens in a very, very micro environment perhaps can lead to the further radicalization at the macro level. But we also look into like international conflicts and how they're internalized by certain actors. And I suppose what's going on in this region is an effect of that, because as my colleagues have already discussed, radicalization or jihadism here has international kind of references, but it's not only in this case, in this region. Obviously, it's also the case in United Kingdom, in France, and other places in Western Europe. Now, in order to understand the radicalization trends, we're building scales. So we just published our radicalization trends report in all countries through studies of hotspots in all these 17 countries. And we're approaching these hotspots through historical feelings of injustice. Why certain feelings of injustice practically remain and retain their significance in these particular societies. They stick around, and so that politicians can really exploit them, because we're interested in actually how the state itself can be an agent of radicalization. And then they would create either their paramilitary groups, or they would create their audiences, likely audiences, who would have this proclivity towards assuming radicalized action around their, let's say, unhappiness. So what appears is when we look into level of aggregation versus relevant scale for understanding trends of radicalization, right-wing clearly operate on a national scale, but within international porosity. So right-wing radicalization has mostly national kind of references, and it does not really necessarily commit crimes across the borders. But they would have international porosity in the sense that extremist right-wing activists, they would refer to each other or refer to events that are happening in other countries. Whereas left-wing radicalization has another relationship to national international scale, that is traditional internationalism within specific national political context. That's what we see in left-wing radicalization. Now, an ongoing discussion with us at the moment is whether we should approach activism around climate issues or adopting extremist kind of positions based on climate change. You may know that certain events are unfolding in Britain at the moment towards the climate summit in Glasgow, where I come from. We're trying to understand actually if we can situate and contextualize climate activism within this left-wing scale as well. We are also trying to, at the moment, understand whether we can situate anti-vax movements within extreme right or nationalist or left-wing. Am I? Sorry. I'm just going to continue now. Anyways, so we also obviously recognize religious varieties of radicalization in Western Europe and beyond. And we're not only approaching religious varieties, obviously, based on jihadism, but we try to see that other religions than Islam could also have, could also create certain threats. That's why we study Georgia very, very closely. Now, at the moment, for us, right-wing radicalization is the main rising threat. Jihadist violence has been generally in decline. Ethno-separatist conflicts still breed significant violence. And we're also seeing almost non-existent threat of left-wing violence. And in this case, typical mechanisms legitimating right-wing radicalization and facilitating its escalation are shifting blame attribution, internalization of the external threat, rationalization of certain heinous acts, relativizing the problem, or civic legitimization. Just to finish, actually, so what will be the typical risks of relying on repression? My colleagues once again mentioned this in their amazing research taking place in non-democratic context, but in the democratic context as well, could have a certain proclivity towards repression through the terror acts that certain state agents are passing. So these risks could be risks for democracy and human rights, obviously, also risks of aggravating injustice, and in our understanding, this would stimulate and this would trigger further radicalization. There could be risks of backlash. There's a mention of involving civil society a lot to de-radicalization initiatives, but nonetheless, there could be some problems to do with outsourcing de-radicalization to civil society, such as source of funding and instability of resources, obviously, with implications for the scale of radicalization that they have to face with, and then the sustainability of their acts in the future. There could be some questions around their legitimacy. And finally, civil society organizations being embedded in small microspheres may have limited range of de-radicalization activities. Now, I believe this has been perfectly 15 minutes, and I hope you enjoyed my talk here, and please have a look at our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Umut, for bringing up this important feature of injustice here as well. And the next speaker is going to be Kamran Palani, a research fellow at the Middle East Research Institute. His research interest is in the Kurdish politics, Iraqi politics, and extremism in Iraq and Middle East. So please, Kamran, have a floor.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Because I'm sitting outside.
Yes, we do. It's perfect. Yes, we do.
Very good. Actually, I'm really happy to join. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really happy to join this amazing panel. I wish I could have joined you physically. I'm at the moment sitting outside a fancy hotel in Erbil, the capital of the Kurdistan region. It's located on the Mosul road, where ISIS declared its caliphate. The city became the de facto capital of the so-called Islamic State and Daesh. So really the content of our paper, which is similar to what Morten said, is part of a PREVEX project. It's still ongoing. We are in the process of finalizing and analyzing the data. And the whole objective is really to compare the situation where I am in now in Erbil and the situation in Mosul, where Daesh declared, it is de facto state. I think these two regions, the Kurdistan region and also the Nineveh region are, first of all, are both located in northern Iraq and can be compared in terms of ethno-religious and sectarian diversity and identity, population, geography, political economy, history, and territory. So there are a lot that we can compare. However, I think this is the most interesting part of our work. Since 2003, since the regime change in Iraq, these two environments, these two communities and regions have produced two different environments. Nineveh became extremely vulnerable to violent extremists, while Kurdistan demonstrated resilience against violent extremism. I think the discussions and the findings and the data of our paper show that, I think this is the key message. It is not possible to understand the occurrence and non-occurrence of violent extremism without understanding the various aspects of governance, identity, and society, including socioeconomic conditions, sects, and religious practices and interpretations, state-society relations, and political process, and importantly, the security structure. In this report, we refer to the 2003 regime change in Iraq as a critical juncture, as a decisive moment to understand the process of occurrence and non-occurrence of violent extremism. In terms of methodology, we have employed mixed methods approach, including survey and also using our past and current and research data. So the key findings and discussions. I will start with the drivers that created an environment enabling for violent extremism in the Nineveh, and then I will focus on the enabling environment against violent extremism, enabling environment for resilience. In the section on Nineveh, we have divided the analysis into three major phases, three major important historical phases. And the first one is the context before the regime change. In the 90s, there was a very important policy at that time. It's called the faith campaign. The faith campaign was a policy introduced by the Saddam regime to use the religion to reduce the negative impacts of the international sanctions on Iraq. So in the context of 90s, in Mosul, in Nineveh, Islamists were empowered by the government, by the Saddam regime. The new Islamist schools were established in this period. So they were really emboldened by the new faith campaign policy of the Saddam regime. So by 2003, when the regime changed, there were only two groups who could really mobilize the population in Nineveh. They were Baathists and the former members of the Baathist regime, and also the Islamists who were in power during the context of 90s. So this is the context prior to the regime change in 2003, which was really important in producing an environment after the regime change very prone to violence and extremism. So what happened after 2003 that further created an environment for violent extremism? First, there was a de-Baathification policy by the new authorities in Baghdad. So they sent all of the members of the Baathist regime home, including university professors, police, university lecturers, and police officers, health people. So everyone in the government was almost excluded from the new political process, from the new governance after 2003. So what this led to it led to create a space for the Islamists who were in power during the context of 90s, during the faith campaign. So that in this period, unlike the case of Kurdistan, which I'm going to talk about it now, there was a deep mistrust from the population towards the new authorities in Baghdad, because the Sunni leaders were removed, excluded from the new decision-making institutions, and then they were really fueled by the new Kurds and the Shia. So there was a deep mistrust among the population in Nineveh. So in this context, what happened really? Al-Qaeda, groups like Al-Qaeda and later the so-called Islamic State, is it a combination of political realities, socio-economic conditions, and grievances to influence and gain local support? And then including groups like Tawheed and Al-Jihad by Musab Zarqawi. So they began really targeting anyone who wanted to cooperate with the new authorities, and very specifically the coalition forces and the US forces. In addition to all of these factors that really pushed the environment, the people towards extremism, and also there was a very harsh security and an exclusionary policy adopted by the new government in Baghdad, excessively targeting the Sunni population and the Sunni leaders under the new anti-terrorism law. And then in this context, it was in this context when the jihadists were consolidated and the mistrust of population was deepening towards the new authorities, and the US forces left Iraq in 2009, created a space and security gap for the new jihadists to really come and to provide protection and leadership for the already marginalized and excluded population of Nineveh. And above all, socio-economic conditions worsened during this period. The unemployment in Nineveh reached to the highest level in Iraq. Women's exclusion from socio-political affairs reached to the highest level in the country. Where we are now in Nineveh, that's still the environment is very conducive to extremism and violence. There is still a stigma. The stigma of Daesh continues to haunt significant sections of the population of Nineveh. There is still mistrust between the ethno-religious communities. And the most important driver with regards to violence and extremism in the case of Nineveh is the militarization of ethno-religious communities in the countries and the emergence of armed and state actors. So really all of these drivers and factors in these three phases, before 2003, after 2003, up to the emergence of Daesh in 2014, and then later the retaking of the territories and the current issues, are all contributing to in environment to violent extremism in the country. I will stop really. I can later provide deeper analysis and also share information about the context of Nineveh. But what is really interesting, because there is a literature on what went wrong in Nineveh, what went wrong in Mosul, how Daesh managed to gain local support. But what is really not, it is poorly studied, and it has not received attention in the literature, is how violent extremism was contained, it was prevented in the case of Kurdistan compared to the situation in Nineveh. This is where the relevance and the importance of the question of occurrence and non-occurrence comes in, even not only for analytical and academic discussions, but also for policy issues. Despite having had an environment prone to extremism and violence, Kurdistan has not witnessed comparable extremism to the one that surfaced in Nineveh. It should be noted that actually the underlying conditions of extremism do exist in Kurdistan. And a very large proportion of the population, including the youth, has experienced the negative effects of Kurdistan's mismanagement and corruption, etc. However, there is no force able to pull many young Kurds towards radicalization, especially leading to religiously framed extremism. Our quantitative and qualitative data highlight 6 major possible answers to how violent extremism was contained and prevented in the case of Kurdistan. After 2003, unlike the case of Nineveh, the Islamists, the Kurdish jihadists accepted the new political order, disarmed their members, and actively engaged in the new political process. In fact, they became the first opposition in the new democratic process after 2003 in Iraqi Kurdistan, in the Kurdistan region. I think the second major explanation to the non-occurrence of violent extremism is the absence of pull factors, such as the appeal of a charismatic Kurdish leader or group or an ideology that can both reach deep into Kurdish society to promote extremist behavior. The third important element, which was absent in the case of Nineveh, the functioning and the effectivity of the Kurdish government's hard security measures in both monitoring and also countering terrorism, and the high level of cooperation and trust between the government security forces and the wider population. The trust between the new security forces and the population was missing in the case of Mosul, just an hour away from Erbil. It was very much powerful here after 2003. Most of the young Kurds later who wanted to join Daesh, they were arrested by the security forces because of the cooperation and trust between the family members of the parents and the family of these young Kurds with the new security forces. So trust and the state-society relations after 2003 was completely different. The social contract was in place in Erbil, the one was emerging in Erbil very completely different from the one that was in place in Mosul. I think there are 3 other interesting drivers and possible explanations. One is in Erbil, in Kurdistan region, unlike the case of Nineveh, there is a historical attachment to the Kurd ethnic issue. So the Kurds in the Kurdistan region define their issue in Iraq as an ethnic issue. So there is a very limited space for religiously framed extremism or driven extremism to gain local support in the case of Kurdistan. But it was very different in Nineveh. As I've mentioned, in the 90s, the faith campaign emboldened the Islamists. However, we should not forget that in the case of Kurdistan, the attachment to the ethnic issue has promoted and justified ethnic-based violence. But what it has prevented was really religiously framed and motivated violence that was very much dominant in Iraq after 2003. And the dominant religious interpretation and practice in Iraqi Kurdistan compared to the Nineveh is largely dependent on spiritual experience, or what's called as Sufism, so making Kurdish areas more inclined to pluralism and tolerance compared to the case of Nineveh. And we should not really forget that the socio-economic conditions in Kurdistan, while I mentioned the unemployment was the highest, the rate of unemployment was the highest in Nineveh, it reached to the lowest unprecedented level and rate in the case of Kurdistan because of the new security and socio-political arrangements in place in Kurdistan. So really the question, I will stop from here, and then the question of occurrence and the non-occurrence is very relevant to the case of Iraq. And there is a lot, though I mentioned that it's a highly contextual, but there is a lot that we can learn from policy level in order to address the at least to prevent extremism in the future in this case, and also share the lessons and transform the lessons into policy recommendations, into decisions and policies in order to prevent violent extremism in the neighboring region of Nineveh. I will stop here, and I'm really happy to provide more explanation, more details if needed, in order to provide and to conceptualize both occurrence and non-occurrence in the case of Kurdistan region and Nineveh. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamaran. So now there is the floor for Q&A. We have a couple of minutes left before the lunch, so anyone who wants to ask questions to our speakers, please raise your hand, and they're here ready for you to answer your questions. So anyone with a question? Everyone is being shy, everyone is being hungry, I guess. Starvation.
When you have lunch at around 3 o'clock, I mean, it's hard to stand to stand in the way for it, perhaps.
So if no one has a question, really no one. All right, so I think we should conclude this panel, and I shall invite you to the lunch, right? So thank you, and please applause for the speakers.
Thank you to all the panelists and moderators for all the interesting discussions. We have a lunch break now that's going to last until 4:30, and then we have another keynote address and the start of the other parts of the BSF.